So hello and good afternoon. Welcome to the Mughal Courtyard at the Jaipur Literary Festival at the British Library this afternoon in association with Diageo. We're delighted to introduce Masala Shakespeare and our wonderful speakers, Varsha Panjwani, Jonathan Gill-Harris and Rachel Dwyer. They will be in conversation with Cary, who we are reliably informed is on his way. So with that, we'll get underway. Thank you.
Hi, I'm going to stand in for Cary till he gets on stage, and so I'm completely unprepared to do this, so please bear with us. But I suppose when we start at the beginning is the session is called after Jonathan Gill-Harris's book, which is not available in the bookshop, so you'll have to find your own way of getting hold of a copy. And let me urge you to do this, because one of the things I think you'll find about it is it's a great read. It's a very readable book, though Jonathan is Professor of English at Ashoka University and a Shakespeare expert. The book is written in a very accessible style, so I think it's something that will definitely appeal. I can see Cary approaching. Shall I carry on, or shall I carry on, or shall I stop? I'm not quite sure. But perhaps let's start off. We all know who Shakespeare is, or we think we do, but could you tell us a bit more about the title of your book, Masala Shakespeare, and how a Firangi writer became Indian?
So, Masala is a word that everyone thinks they know the meaning of. And I've had a lot of people who've not read the book come up to me with a great deal of confidence to tell me what they think about it on the basis of what they understand Masala to mean. So one person came up to me, in fact, this morning and said, "So you've written a book on Shakespeare and Indian cooking?"
So just keep an eye
Bubble, bubble.
Actually, there is quite a bit on cooking in the book.
It's 2 o'clock, not 1 o'clock.
But Masala, as many of you know, means so many different things. And I'm deliberately trying to tap into its many meanings. In fact, deliberately tapping into many things at once is kind of the theme of the book. But most locally, Masala refers to a subgenre of Hindi cinema that was popularized in the late 70s, 80s. We associate it with the films of Manmohan Desai, with Ramesh Sippy, the movies that Javed Akhtar and Salim wrote music and lyrics for. These are often dismissed as escapist, crowd pleasers, but they're called Masala films because they are absolutely committed to mixture. They mix up tragedy and comedy. They mix up seemingly realistic sequences with completely melodramatic, over-the-top, dishum scenes of violence. Song and dance, of course, is absolutely crucial. Now, even though the Masala movie belongs specifically in Hindi movie history to this period of the 70s and the 80s, and Masala films are still being made now, although arguably they're dying out. There's a way in which Hindi cinema has always been Masala, in the sense that unlike certain artistic traditions in the West, not Shakespeare, by the way, Masala has always been committed to generic mixture. And mixture of a kind that is not only stylistic in the way that I've already suggested, it's also linguistic. One of the big misnomers about Hindi films is that they're in Hindi, because they're certainly not ever in Shuddh or pure Hindi. They keep swerving between Hindi and Urdu and Punjabi and sometimes Bhojpuri and English. They're Masala also, and this is the crucial part, because they're made for mixed audiences. And for me, one of the most transformative experiences of my time living in India was going to a single-screen cinema hall for the first time in 2001 and watching the now classic film Lagan. And what so transfixed me about the experience was not the Masala I was seeing on screen, and there was plenty of Masala, song and dance, completely unbelievable sequences involved with a sort of element of something real, entailing British colonial history in India. What for me was most seductively Masala was what was happening in the audience. And as someone who'd grown up in New Zealand, who'd been trained to be very polite every time he went into a cinema or a theatre where I'd paid money, once you paid money, you actually give away the right to be impolite. You're meant to sit quietly in the dark and say, very good. So I was astonished when, first of all, when I came into this huge cinema, the Chanakya Theater in Delhi. It was pulled down a long time ago, but it was bigger than anything I'd ever seen. And I was straight away taken up to the balconies, where virtually everyone was speaking English. But the language I could hear most of was coming from the pit. It was Hindi. And the people in the seats there regarded the seats simply as accessories, because very quickly they were standing on them. When Amir Khan made his first entrance, they were flinging coins at the screen. When the first song sequence appeared, when Udit Narayan was singing and Amir Khan was lip-syncing sort of, they all sang along as they tossed coins at the screen. Mitava, ye mitava, tujhko kya dar hai re, ye terti apni hai. Now, I didn't understand a word at that time, but something happened. The Shakespearean in me recognized that there was something about the single-screen cinema, as exotic and strange as it was, that was nonetheless Shakespearean. That this was a venue in which people from very, very different backgrounds came together, mixed with each other, had to take cognizance of each other in some way. And the film reflected that. The film didn't hold a mirror up to nature in the way that Hamlet advises, but it was clear that the film had been made for a mixed audience in a way that the more niche art films that I was accustomed to seeing in the West didn't. The characters in the cricket team that prevail over the British include not only Hindu, but also Muslim, Sikh, Dalit, untouchable. They're coached by a woman. And years later, when I saw the film, after having studied Hindi, I realized there was something about that first song and its use of the pronoun apna that was extraordinarily inclusive. Apna meaning sort of our, your, all of us. The apna was the pronoun par excellence of Masala. Now, not only did the audience match the kind of audience loosely that Shakespeare was writing for, where people would pay a penny to stand in the pit and an extra penny to go up into the balconies and a small fortune to sit on stage with the actors. So you had people all across the political spectrum. Shakespeare was also scandalously not writing in English, even though we think of him now as the English playwright par excellence. English had not yet been standardized at the time he was writing. Shakespeare had to cater to multilingual, translingual constituencies, people who spoke a dialect that was heavily Anglo-Saxon, people who spoke a related dialect that had much more French in it, people who, despite the Protestant Reformation that had dispensed with Latin as the language of the liturgy, were familiar with Latin terms and expressions from grammar school, from wherever. Shakespeare had to work with all these constituencies, and the language that he wrote in, as did many of his fellow playwrights, was translingual as a result, in much the same way that a Hindi Masala movie was, in much the same way that the language of Lagan was. So I came to realize that Masala was not only potentially a very receptive destination for Shakespeare. It's no accident that Shakespeare's plays have been reinterpreted, reimagined, refitted, rejigged over and over again in Hindi cinema. It's also that Hindi cinema can help us understand elements of Shakespeare that have now become invisible thanks to the institutionalization over 400 years of Shakespeare as the national playwright, as literature rather than as mass entertainment, as English with a capital E, rather than this Masala polyglot stew. So for me, Masala is not just a phenomenon from India in the 70s and the 80s, or something more broadly that describes the diversity, the mixture of Indian languages, religions, traditions. it is also a lens that allows us to make better sense of Shakespeare and the imaginative worlds that he not only produced, but that were to a certain extent forced on him by virtue of the medium in and for which he was working.
Thank you. Could I just pick up on, first of all, I love this book because it does take you back through the single screen cinema masala moments, which I have enjoyed. So guilty, everyone who has danced in the aisles of cinema halls. I'm raising my hand up here. Thank you. Yes, there are others as well. Great. And I want to pick up on that dancing, the Nach Gana, that kind of united us in the theaters when we were seeing these movies in single screen. And I think although that is fast disappearing, we still have a sort of vestige of it in the very, very cherished item numbers, item songs. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, it's a very Bollywood convention. Item numbers are where you'd find women singing to and dancing to these really, really raunchy lyrics. And people love them in the cinema halls. We all get up, we dance, we replicate kind of moves, as Gil, you were saying. And usually people kind of, love to hate item numbers. But I'm glad to have an ally in Gil because we both just love these item songs. Indeed. And instead of people arguing that these are sexist and they objectify women, I actually think that they allow women to express their sexual desires, something that has long been a no-go zone for heroines in Bollywood. I'm going to prove my point by giving you lyrics of one of the favorite item songs, and I'm sure many of you on the audience have heard this, and this is from Omkara, an excellent adaptation of Othello, and the song is Bidi jalaile jigar se piya, jigar ma badi aag hai. And to translate, it means this woman is saying, light a fag from the fire of my desire, sweetheart. Indeed, it's a very powerful expressions of female desire. And although this might seem a world very removed from Shakespeare, I think that's exactly what Shakespeare is doing. And one of the direct links of this, and there are several, but one of the direct links of this can be found in Ophelia's songs in Hamlet, when she allegedly goes mad. And she comes out with these songs and she sings these really sexual and bawdy numbers. And for that moment at least, these songs help her to break out of the misogyny of the Danish court. So I think that item songs, or looking at the masala lens or item song lens to look at Shakespeare's heroines, and I use it in my teaching, my students, when they looked at item songs first and then evaluated Ophelia with these item songs, realized that even though they're presented as docile and passive sometimes, Shakespeare heroines also have a fire in their belly, jigarma badi aag hai. So it's an incredibly useful lens to look at Shakespeare, I'd say.
Cary, would you like to come in on any point?
Yeah, I think for me, I'm fascinated by the history of how Shakespeare came into the India as part of the colonial experience. I think that's a very unknown context or little discussed context. The fact, I think films like Shakespeare, for example, give you some idea of the colonial how colonialism brought Shakespeare into India through the plays and traveling plays and theatre, and I think that's a fascinating area that has not been described in detail, and the whole idea of how the British came into India with their arts and cultures. The French came in with the language into the colonial experience very strongly. The British came in with religion, as we know, before the first mutiny, or War of Independence. And then there was a process where there was a kind of a cultural expansion, and then part of that cultural expansion was the expansion of Shakespeare, which came in as the kind of great storyteller, the as you say, the multi-dimensional character with many different plays that covered a whole range of experience. And I think that's a fascinating exploration of the process of colonialization through arts and culture, which I think it's deeply embedded into Indian culture now. If you go to, I mean, for example, the cinema of South India is heavily, you see quite often bits of Shakespearean plays pop up in different films, not just the whole play, not the whole, one particular play, of which there are many films, but also just a scene from Romeo and Juliet on a balcony. There's a scene from As You Like It, different scenes you'll see in South Indian cinema, for example. And I think it's fascinating how it's pervaded into part of the Indian psyche and arts and culture, and how, in some ways, it, as you say, reflects the Masala, our taste for the kind of traditional Marathi or Sanskrit theatre, and having the mixture of the six rasas in terms of one performance, and how that Shakespeare very easily adapts into that, but also how that process kind of gives us a kind of post-colonial context, and how that possibly helps us relate to the global world that we live in, which of course Britain dominated much of the world, and still through America does influence us, but also how it's pervaded the Indian psyche in many different ways. So I think that's a fascinating area. Don't know what you guys think.
Would you like to respond to?
So, I mean, two things I'd say. First of all, Shakespeare hasn't taken one route to get to India. The colonists brought Shakespeare. Thanks to Thomas Macaulay, they believed that Shakespeare would sort of provide cultural medicine to Indians in need of uplifting. But fortunately, Indians found ways of taking Shakespeare and making Shakespeare their own. So that what we see, in one sense, is a legacy of colonialism. But perhaps the most interesting route Shakespeare took into India is through the Parsee Theater in the 19th century. And the Parsee Theater was really the first commercial theater in India, in Bombay. The practitioners had to cater for, again, a multilingual audience who spoke Marathi, Gujarati, Urdu, English, Hindi. They had been force-fed Shakespeare at Elphinstone College, one of the British colonial institutions, and had committed to rote memory passages from Shakespeare. This is the sort of karaoke bar version of Shakespeare that was so popular for a long time, that if you commit a passage of Shakespeare to memory, you'll somehow be spiritually exalted by the experience. But you can see the Parsee Theater practitioners sort of gaining revenge against this form of entertainment by taking these fragments that they've been forced to learn, twisting them, and cooking them up in completely new sauces. So you get Hamlet with a happy ending, or you get a fragment of Romeo and Juliet with a fragment of Taming of the Shrew and a fragment of Kalidasa. But there was no idea of the sacredness of the text, or rather, if the text was sacred, it was a sacred text that needed to be tipped over. And I wouldn't see this as out-and-out anti-colonial rebellion. But there was a sense that one could do with Shakespeare things that Shakespeare himself had done with his own sources. After all, it's easy for us to forget that of the 37 surviving Shakespeare plays, all of them were basically patched, cut and pasted from other sources. We are wedded now to the idea of artistic geniuses producing fully formed from their brilliant imaginations works of art. But that's a very modern, dare I say, capitalist idea of art as intellectual property that originates in an individual and that is designed to be received as a commodity by an individual. But Shakespeare was writing in a very different time, with a very different mindset. I think the appropriate analogy for what he does is not property, intellectual property, but cooking. When you go to a restaurant, you don't want something that is absolutely new and original. You want a familiar meal, but with extra ingredients thrown in, with an extra twist. And that's masala, in a cardamom nutshell. But it's interesting, cooking, as I was writing this book, sort of became an almost irresistible metaphor for thinking about the relationship between entertainment and an audience. Even the term rasa is very interesting in this context. I think in the West we're very used to thinking of entertainment, not just in the age of cinema, but even theatre, through the sense of sight alone. We go to see a play. And there's a way in which seeing, especially if you're sitting in a darkened theatre, involves a fantasy of distance from what you're seeing. You can be emotionally drawn in, but the idea is that you're sort of a voyeur peering through a keyhole at another universe that you're safely quarantined from. The idea of the rasa, which means flavor, amongst other things, is that the relationship between actor and audience is much more interactive and dynamic. If what is being given to you is a flavor rather than simply something to see or spy on, you're bodily interacting with it in a much more sort of dynamic and transformative and unpredictable way. And nothing better describes what I saw that day in the Chanakya Theatre many years ago than rasa. People jumping up in their seats to start dancing exactly the same way Amir Khan and Gracie Singh were dancing. This was a much more dynamic, interactive mode of consumption than what we've been socialized into. So that's what I'd say, that if we pursue masala and rasa back to the culinary and gastronomic roots of those metaphors, we can also see histories of working with Shakespeare that go beyond the colonial history of Shakespeare in India.
Especially today, picking up on the kind of rasa or the experience, or what I really love about your book is this idea of Indians taking on Shakespeare and doing with Shakespeare what Shakespeare was doing with his own sources. So he is taking sources, all of these from elsewhere, and then synthesizing them, putting his own spin on it, doubling and kind of, adding to it, putting his own stamp on it as well as he's doing it, but cooking with it. And a lot of Indian cinema does that. So for instance, a very, very popular movie, Goliyon Ki Ras Leela, Ram Leela, is not only an adaptation of Romeo and Juliet, but it's also an adaptation of the Ramayana, Ram Leela. And lots of kind of Indian cinema does that, kind of take from various sources. It's not just a simple Shakespeare adaptation. And I would even go further to say that it's not only Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet and Ramayana, but it's also West Side Story and Romeo plus Juliet mixed in. So all of these things are being taken in and then cooked into a kind of masala pot, as it were. But what I find fascinating about that is that for me, the biggest thing is that this masala mixture has led to some really powerful, nuanced portrayals of Shakespeare's women in Bollywood cinema. So, for instance, I'm obsessed with Goliyon Ki Ras Leela, Ram Leela, by the way. And I wrote about how Juliet is kind of, combined with Sita from the Ramayana to make Leela, who becomes, as a result, very nuanced and powerful. And right now I'm writing about Mallika'i Gertrude in a 1954 version of Hamlet. And
the Kishore Sahu.
Yes, the Kishore Sahu version. And also Ghazala in the recent Hamlet adaptation of Haidar. And they both become such multifaceted kind of characters or portrayals of Gertrude, because it's not only Shakespeare's Gertrude, but also the prominence of the mother figure in the Bollywood imaginary that's behind these powerful portrayals. So, in effect, I will actually point out to one of the very important aspects in your book. What I want to argue, my main point is this, that actually the conjunction and is a feminist concept. So very often women are presented in terms of or, sensual or pure, maternal or ambitious, but actually ditching the conjunction or and taking on the and. This mixture and that mixture produces these multi-layered depictions of Shakespeare's women in Bollywood. And the greatest thing about this masala concept is the conjunction and, right? We're not doing purity, we're not doing this or this, we're doing this and this, which makes for really powerful women characters on Bollywood screens as well, I would say.
Rachel, you have to.
No, mine's sort of, I really enjoyed your analyses and you're looking at the films here, but I'm sort of slightly worried about flattening of a lot of terms here, like, why masala, you said at the beginning that people don't know what masala is, and I obviously think it's something slightly different from what you do, and bringing in, melodrama, because in a way, when you read, like when I studied Sanskrit drama, we were always told, oh, it's not as good as Greek drama, and Greek drama has this, and this is, everything was compared. And I suppose it's those points of comparison. If we start comparing 6th century courtly drama in Sanskrit, you can see a lot of that in Shakespeare, and you can see, so it's not, I'm very convinced by your readings, but I'm slightly worried about, does everything then, is everything, like on Goodness Gracious Me, everything Shakespeare's Indian, that's one of the things I think I'd like you to tease out a little bit. Yeah. Not that I'm not convinced by your arguments, but I'd just like to know a bit more about the process to get there.
Well, that's a huge question, Rachel. I think you're right to warn against a sort of lazy universalization of some of the concepts here. I'd like to think this is a book very much rooted in a time and place. Although I bring with me many times and places that inflect my particular take on living in India in the 21st century. So the thing that I really want to stress is that for me, this book is partly a celebration, but it's also, in a way, a sort of obsequy. I'm mourning the passing of an idea of India that I think was embodied in the form of the masala film. And I think the form of that film has a certain politics that we're losing now, at this moment, since 2014 in India. The masala film is a film that, whether one defines it very locally in terms of the 1970s, 80s films that I was talking about, or more broadly in the way I'd suggested in my opening remarks, it's a film that, to pick up on Varsha's point, valorizes not only mixture, but conjunctivity, that there's room for everyone. You can see it in the composition of frames. I can show a picture from a recent film. It's always good to have pictures if one can see it. That's the cover of the book that's not available in the bookstore right now, so I need to plug it as much as possible. But I'm told that Hayon Y, the branch of the bookstore, is going to have it come Monday. So anyway, that's your homework. So, Ye Javani Hai Divani. This is a recent film that is, in some ways, a masala film, is in some ways not, but it starts off with an item number involving Madhuri Dixit and Ranbir Kapoor. And the composition of that is, in some ways, the quintessence of masala. It's loud, it's colourful, but it is absolutely crammed. And there's a way in which this is a metaphor for the aesthetic of masala, but also for the ethos of masala. There's always room for one more. It doesn't matter. We can add something else. It reminds me of some of the scooter rickshaws I see in Haryana that nominally seat 4 people, but there are 36 people somehow crammed into it and sitting on top as well. A masala film has bodies, items, things hanging from it, and there's always room for more. Now that room, as I've suggested, is not just in terms of what we can see visually, but is also something that extends to our experience of what it means to be Indian. It's what I call the more than oneness. That I'm not just my clan or my community. I am also what I'm not. I may be Hindu, but I'm just as much Muslim. I'm just as much Christian because this is part of the world I live in. Now, if we cut ahead,
Don't fall off.
I'll try not to fall off. There's too much good stuff here. All right. So here's the poster for Mother India, an iconic film, which we wouldn't call a masala film. It doesn't belong to that genre. It's a sort of epic film, a social film. But it's masala in terms of how it imagines India as a collectivity of languages and religions. You'll look here, this is an English language poster, but the title is not only in English, it's also, you see the title in Devanagari, Hindi, and in Nastaliq, Urdu. This used to be a standard part of any credit sequence in a Hindi film, that you would get English, Roman script, Nastaliq script, Devanagari. There was always room for more. That is disappearing. More and more in the title credit sequences, either they are simply in Devanagari or they're simply in English, because the more niche films that we're getting nowadays, which are targeted towards often Anglophone audiences, people actually can't read Hindi even if they speak it. So they need their script in Roman script. But a film like this recalls, and I know this sounds potentially a little bit conservative and nostalgic, but it's hard not to feel nostalgic now in an age where increasingly the idea of India is being singularized with very violent consequences.
Now, can I follow you up on this a bit? Can I interrupt you? Because I think this is a very important point you're making here. So, like, people talk about the Nehruvian films of the 1950s, like Mother India, say, embodying ideals of development and the village and so on. But then, you know, masala in the 70s, what's going on there, you know, people link it to the emergency and that sort of post-emergency breakdown of the consensus after independence. Then Bollywood in the 90s, post-liberalisation, the rise of the new middle classes and so on. But then something's going on now, and with these indie films, I mean, it seems, are we seeing perhaps not everything in one film, but a diversity of genre to the indie, the nationalist? This year we've seen the most extraordinary nationalist films we've ever seen, you know, like Manikarnika and Uri and these kinds of films.
Yeah.
So
how's the Josh?
Hi, sir. Hi. So what is going on today, do you think? I mean, can we do that? I mean, I know you can't oversimplify, but do you think it's actually groups are splitting off? Or do you, and the genre can't hold? I mean, you know, perhaps the last masala film was one of the Munnabai films, I don't know.
Or Baijan. I think Salman Khan is still making masala films, but he's sort of the last holdout. I mean, I think on the one hand, this diversity, independent films, niche films, is something to celebrate because we're getting many more films and potentially interesting films. On the other hand, there's part of me that thinks no matter how much diversity there is, in terms of the mode of consumption, actually what we're getting is homogenization. Because nowadays audiences tend to sit with people who are just like them. Less and less are people asked to step outside their bubble and experience a film in the company of people radically different from them. And I think that is a loss. For my students, sorry, I've lost sound here. For my students at Ashoka University in Delhi, I mean, they're wonderful students, bright students, but I've weirdly become their native informant because aspirationally, what they watch is on Netflix, and it's all English language, sometimes European art house. Hindi films for them are what their aunties watch. They're embarrassing. When I get them to do a thought experiment and tell me, what's the first word you associate with masala, what comes back to me is disgusting or crass, excessive, over the top, embarrassing. So I think there is a way in which the single screen cinema as a venue was more than simply a way for film companies to make money. It was also a public space in which a certain idea of India could be formed. And although we can distinguish the Nehruvian film from the Masala film from the Bollywood film, there's a certain continuity up to the age of the multiplex, precisely because of the mixed nature of the audience. As soon as audiences are being subdivided and segregated, and now that Netflix is ensuring that people are receiving their films much more privately, we have different ideas of India, different ideas of relationality, different ideas also of transgression. It's very interesting that Bornala Chatterjee, who's made an adaptation of Titus Andronicus called The Hungry, an Indian film, but you wouldn't know it watching it, even though it's set at a Punjabi shadi, a wedding. She says, I prefer Netflix to the the single screen cinema, precisely because in the single screen cinema you are interrupted all the time by people being noisy, by the person sitting next to you shouting at the screen, by people dancing. With Netflix, I get to control the environment. And I think that remark is so sadly symptomatic of what's happening. It's not just in India, it's around the world, but it's the increasing atomization of the consumption of arts, the experience of society, the experience of what it means to relate to other people.
I'm very sorry, I didn't realise, I wasn't the chair, so I didn't realise the time limit. I've been shown we've only got 10 minutes left. And, you know, because we want the audience to join in after all this enthusiasm, I'm sorry. It's going to be 15 minutes, right, sorry, I wasn't the chair. So Cary, I know, wanted to just say something.
I just wanted to say something about the non-Masala film in terms of my work at the BFI London Film Festival and the London Indian Film Festival.
I want to interrupt. Cary just got an MBE last week for his work on Indian cinema in the UK. Much deserved.
So if you want to pick up a leaflet on the London Indian Film Festival, it's outside. But I'd just like to say that there are many films from all over India in different languages that are non-Masala. They're the serious, independent films that make you think, that are out there that are on Shakespearean themes as well, particularly from South India, films from the Tamil cinema, from the times of Ellis Duggan, who was one of the pioneers of, we've got some images of that, of early Indian cinema in Tamil cinema, who pioneered some of the early Shakespearean themed subjects. They were commercial films, but also more recent films like filmmakers like Jayaraj, for example, who's made a number of very powerful films purely on drama and a single narrative, not Masala film.
Two of them are the bottom row there, Veeram and Kaliyatham.
Great. Kaliyatham is an amazing film you should definitely check out. So I would say there are a number of independent films and also filmmakers from Bengal, for example, who have been very dedicated to the themes and have been influenced by Shakespeare's themes. And you may see that in many different Bengali art house filmmakers' films as well. You may see a scene influence from Shakespeare. Obviously, Bengal has a very particular influence about the British experience. It was the capital of empire. So again, that whole narrative and discourse post-colonial carries on. So that's my suggestion to you as a kind of closing thing. And I know you, if you wanted to pick anything up from there.
I'll add to that, Cary, actually. And I think London Indian Film Festival is amazing. So check it out next week. Don't miss it if you're here.
And it's also in Birmingham as well, isn't it?
Birmingham,
Yeah,
Manchester,
Birmingham as well.
and Stockwell,
Oh,
Stockford.
wow, okay. But what festivals such as kind of these have shown us is that independent films are also very diverse. So although I would say that there might be more of a bifurcation of audience in terms of single screen cinema, it's not the kind of same thing, but then there are movies within independent cinema as well, which have a very symbiotic relationship with masala and Bollywood sensibilities as well. And especially if they're inspired by Shakespeare, they can't help being plural and diverse, and masala as well. So again, one of the movies that I saw recently called Nobleman by Vandana Kataria is an independent film on Merchant of Venice. And it's very dark, almost sickening in terms of in the best kind of Shakespearean way, sickening. But then the way it marketed itself was by reinterpreting the song Ye Duniya Agar Mil Bhi Jaye To Kya Hai. So in a way, they are in a very symbiotic relationship with Bollywood and doing masala themselves. A movie which we both love, 10 ml Love, which is an adaptation of Midsummer Night's Dream, ostensibly is an independent film, but also mixes Ram Leela, it mixes the big shadi convention, and although it isn't shown in single screen cinemas, they are still kind of characterized by a masala sensibility, although the masala sensibility here is critiqued as well as played on as well. So I would say that independent cinema is also equally diverse in its range. So they might be targeting very kind of, singular audiences, but there are also independent films equally that are targeting these mixed audiences.
Should we try and
I'm going to do that. I'm just going to say, because I know lots of you will have questions, and we want to give you, we've got a good 10 minutes for questions, even more perhaps if we're lucky.
Yeah.
I just wanted to just tell you a little bit more about the book, because I know you ask questions without having been lucky enough to read the book. And it's set in several acts, like a Shakespeare play, acts and scenes. And so the history of the masala and tracing various films of Shakespeare which have been remade. I know one section you're all going to be asking about is Vishal Bhardwaj. And indeed, there is a long section on that, so I hope that's something you are going to ask about. But one thing about the book that I must say, and you might have got an impression, Gill has got some really terrible jokes in here. And one of the things that I was very disappointed he didn't put in my favourite all-time awful Shakespeare and Ajit joke, which is, give him the Hamlet poison so he goes from to be to not to be, which doesn't actually appear in here. So with that, I'd like to open questions to the audience, please. Is there a mic going round? So will you please wait till you've got the mic to ask your question? Just put up your hand. First one over here. Thank you. Thank you. Brilliant.
That was a wonderful talk and wonderful discussion. I wanted to share with you, and I dare say you're aware of it, the influence of the Indian masala film, the single screen, in the Arab world as well. I have had, now this might be anecdotal, an Egyptian woman from Cairo who said that the custom on Eid days in Cairo was that you receive guests, you have your food, etc., and you wash all the dishes, and you settle down and watch an Indian movie. And then my experience in a village in Anatolia, in Turkey, this man who was Kurdish was singing Gar Aya Mera Pardesi.
Amazing.
But also I share with the author his nostalgia for the old single screen movie, which also had its own element of sensual innuendo.
Yes.
Of course.
I remember one particular very, very old film called Nek Parvi, and in which, at the wedding, these Qawwali women sang a song called Kaun Aya Saheli Aaj Teri Gali Mein. Now that, I did not have to have a single track mind to realize what was being said there. And then likewise in Mother India, the song, you will remind me, the song is, what was it now? I will not show my veiled to you. Was that the one, the song you remember?
I don't know which one.
Pataneni.
Yes,
But
yes, yes. Sorry, no, Monica, I think I can't remember the song now, actually. But
So, well, thank you for sharing that with us. And there's lots of very smutty bits in the book as well. So you'll enjoy those when you read it.
Absolutely, totally.
Next question, let's take one from over here. We'll take the lady here.
Thank you for your talk. I have a suggestion for your Masala Shakespeare, and it's this. If you were to take a Shakespeare sonnet, I've done this with German, and you can do it with Hindi. You get somebody who's bilingual to translate it into Hindi, and you then get somebody who's bilingual, somebody else, to translate it from Hindi back into English. And then you compare it and you see what new ideas have come up. It's a very exciting and interesting exercise. And if you want to make it more peculiar still, you get it translated by Google.
I think that's a useful comment. Could we have some direct questions to the author as well, please? Thanks. There's one here at the front.
Here.
Hi, so I mean, we've already touched upon this a little bit, where we noted that because of the digital platforms that are now available thanks to Jio in India, the Indian audiences no longer have the time or the patience to go to a theatre every single weekend like they used to potentially to watch a movie, unless it's a Salman Khan movie. We've seen some of the other Khans have failed in the past year, and Salman Khan's the only one who's defied every logic with Bharat. So what do you think is the recipe that they used to say, that there's a recipe for masala movie, like David Dhawan used to say? What do you think is the new age recipe for a good masala movie, apart from Salman Khan being in it?
Unfortunately, I think the recipe is bhaijan these days. I really think we focus so much on what's in the frame that we forget the cooking utensils. And the medium of the single screen cinema hall was so crucial. There are fewer and fewer venues in which Indians from different classes and different communities mingle. And I find this deeply sad. I think there are economic imperatives behind it. I think there are political and religious imperatives too, right now. But there's a drive to segment and homogenize. And unfortunately, the movies that are coming out now reflect that.
But that's a wider thing, isn't it? You know, private estates, private roads, private universities.
Yes, I'm part of the problem, yes.
You know, that this is all part of, I think, the problem that people are no longer forced to mix.
Could I actually say that the recipe for Masala Shakespeare now is in British Asian theatre? And I present Exhibit A and Exhibit B. So this is Darokand, and this was produced by Tribe Arts, a British Asian theatre company. And it's a mixture of various Shakespeare plays, Mughal costumes, Gothic architecture and kind of costumes, and Game of Thrones. So here you are, and if you see kind of, you know, Lady Macbeth, that's her costume. A turban in the Mughal style, steampunk kind of, you know, Gothic jacket here, and if you see carefully, a plaid border as well. So here are some of the lost kind of, you know, spaces, and I think the recipe for Masala Shakespeare and is not in kind of Bollywood, but actually in British Asian Shakespeare adaptations. So check them out. I give you
I
those.
really liked your comments about Haider and the ghost of Salman Khan in Haider. So those of you who've seen Haider or not seen it, the Vishal Bhardwaj's adaptation of Hamlet, I think the ghost of Salman Khan is something fascinating in that film. Yeah, Muni. Mike to Muni.
It's a question for Jonathan. As you're talking about the masala and the recipe and the fact that it's a formula really, and it's very formative, what will happen when the song, which is already fading out of Indian films, when that leaves the cinema, the filmmaking, what will happen? Because the length should be much shorter, and that you will not be able to express ideas through poetry.
I think we've seen perhaps the hugest revolution formally in terms of how music is used. So increasingly, Hindi films, as you know, use music as background. You will get something approaching a Bollywood item number in the closing credits now. But it's more something that people can turn their back on as they leave. I've always said, and this is to pick up on something Varsha was saying before, the item number is the most Shakespearean part of a Hindi film or a Masala film. And for two reasons. One is linguistic. The poetry that great poets like Javed Akhtar, Gulzar have produced, that's something we're now losing. Because the fashion now is, there was a brief flurry of interest in Qawwali and Sufi music in the early 2010s, but now it's, oh yeah, R&B. I'm sorry, there's not too much poetry there. But I think the second part that we're losing, the item number, Karan Johar said very, very imperiously, I'm not going to have item numbers in my movies anymore because they're sexist. And I think that's unfortunate that he feels that way, because I think item numbers, they can often be visually sexist, but they can often be, as Varsha was saying, very interesting spaces of sort of commentary slightly outside the movie. And they're slightly outside the movie because they invite an element of interaction, and not just interaction in the sense of singing along, but people will immediately start performing the dance moves and the song outside the theatre in exactly the same way that a lot of Shakespeare's lines were remembered. This is very different from students at Elphinstone College by rote memory learning a speech or a soliloquy. Shakespeare had a lot of songs in his plays, and people remembered these songs, and it was a good way of advertising a play, was to put a song in it that could be reproduced afterwards, but also emotionally inhabited by the person who had heard it. Every performance of a Shakespeare play would end with what Nick Bottom in A Midsummer Night's Dream calls a burger mask, which is basically Nach Gana routine. So even at the end of Hamlet, everyone's dead, the corpses spring up, and but not only was this what people had paid to come and see, it also bonded them together in something that went beyond simply me. This is Shakespeare's version of apna, that when there's a song, when there's a burger mask, we become more than simply an artisan or a noble. We are people in the audience having a collective experience, and we can relate to each other slightly differently from the everyday hierarchies that have been imposed on us. That's what we're losing.
Take away the bond that happened outside the cinema was the song.
Yes.
That is gone. That is why there's not that strong a bond. The only bond is through the stars.
Yes.
It's not the music. Because when the gentleman here talks about songs, he's referring to songs that are 60 years old.
Yes.
Nobody will quote a song from the last year.
Except for Apna Time Aayega. And that I will stand for.
That's because it talks to the young. It's not across the board.
Is it on? Yes. What did you think of Vishal Bhardwaj's adaptations of this trilogy?
You'll have to read Act 4 of my book.
There's a huge amount.
There's about 100 pages worth, and even that is a fraction of what I think. I think they're extraordinary. I think they're brilliant. If there's any justice in the canonization of cultural artifacts, these will be studied 100, 400 years from now. But I think it's no coincidence, by the way, that Vishal Bhardwaj, like Sanjay Leela Bhansali, the director of Ram Leela, like Gulzar, the director of Angur, is a musician and a poet. And I think there are ways in which we are losing the music of Shakespeare. We're seeing adaptations more and more that are based simply on plot. But what Vishal Bhardwaj or Sanjay Leela Bhansali gets is something else that resides in the music. And it's not just a tune or a melody. It's something that involves a sort of masala relationality. As Muni was saying here, music is something that unites people. How do we find the concord out of this discord? Theseus asks in Midsummer Night's Dream. That is a musical question he's asking. How do we find music out of all the differences that we have here? It's not singing in harmony, singing Kumbaya, but it's about being able to forge some kind of collective experience that goes beyond the simple, narrow straitjackets of identity that are pushed on us.
Okay, last question.
Sorry, I'm just going to say something that a brilliant thing that Gil's book does about this as well is shows us not what Shakespeare does for diversity, but what diversity does for Shakespeare. So that when we see these plural kind of, Shakespeare's adaptations, such as Vishal Bhardwaj, Shakespeare starts singing again, and I think that's what your book really, really helps us do. So read the book.
So what struck me about the book Masala Shakespeare, or for that matter the earlier book, The First Firings, which is also about India, is the genre of the books. It is so unique and unconventional. It has the ingredients, the masala ingredients of the personal, the historical, and the academic. So I was struck by how it could actually be a response to how, when you said that Shakespeare being an import to India, which has been adapted and interpreted on India's own terms, and to talk about that, you also needed a different narrative structure and genre. If you could tell us if you were conscious about it, or if it came across while you were writing.
I'll answer, thank you, that's a lovely question. I'll answer it very quickly. I cannot stand purity. I think purity is drastically overrated, and it's a term that has a lot of currency right now in political discourse in India. I value impurity. I think we need to embrace it more, because I think every one of us is impure no matter how much we narrate ourselves as pure. Every one of us has two parents. That means our DNA is mixed, whether we like it or not. The basic number, the irreducible number, is not one, but more than one. I think India has driven home to me that truth in a way that has been helpful for me in my writing. But I'd like to think this is not just a truth of India, this is a truth universally. We're living in a time, though, where we crave purity and singularity with incredibly violent consequences. So this book is also about how can we imagine a world that allows us to embrace mixture, impurity, more than oneness at a time when it's under siege.
Well, that's a lovely way. That's a lovely way to end today's discussion. I'm sorry that we only had the prologue. Now you have to buy the book. You have to buy the book, but you won't be able to get it signed. Have you got a plan for more talks in the UK? Or?
No, I'm getting the hell out of here tomorrow. So got to fly. But if people will have me back, I'll come.
Okay, well, thank you to all our panelists. Thank you. Thank you, Varsha. Thank you, Cary. Thank you very much to Gil.
Thank you, Rachel.